Podcasts are one of the best ways to build trust with potential customers and to create a base of content that can be used for marketing and sales. Much of the podcast industry, however, is focused on B2C or entertainment or all of those other areas. So Build That Podcast is bringing you the B2B PodCon. It's a conference specifically designed for you in the B2B space. Join hundreds of B2B podcast professionals this November in Nashville, Tennessee, and learn from industry leaders, experienced podcasters, and content strategists. Walk away motivated with actionable steps that you can implement immediately. So tickets go on sale July 24th at the best price you will find. So go to b2bpodcon.com to learn more. Make sure to sign up for the email list. We're going to send out updates on speakers as well as ticket information as it becomes available, all of it through the email. Don't miss the premier event for B2B podcast professionals. Go to b2bpodcon.com to learn more.
And it turns out we did the math and we're like, we could transcribe a lot of podcasts and analyze them without spending, millions of dollars. So we decided, let's transcribe all these podcasts. Let's put them into a database. Let's start using some machine learning and AI, and let's see what kind of value we can get out of it.
Welcome to It's Marketing's Fault, the podcast where we discuss how to do marketing the right way. I'm your host, Eric Rutherford. Before we jump into today's episode, let me encourage you to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you would drop a review, not only will that give me feedback, but that will also help boost the visibility of the podcast so other people can find this podcast and benefit from it as much as you are. So wherever you listen to podcasts, would love for you to drop a review. All right. Let's jump into today's episode. I am pumped because I have with me today Joe Tannorella and Luke Belbina. They are the co-founders of PodEngine, which is an all-in-one podcast research and media monitoring solution. Joe's a long product manager and developer. Luke, he is a serial entrepreneur and first-time dad, which means he is getting zero sleep in the current month. So Joe, Luke, welcome to the show.
Hey, pleasure to be here, Eric. Thanks for having us.
Eric. It is my pleasure. And one of the things that, as you guys and I have talked and connected over the last couple of months, just really, I think PodEngine's fascinating and looking forward to diving into that. Before we do, though, what is something about podcast discoverability that most people think is true, but that you guys disagree with?
All right. You want to take this one?
I'll take this one. Yeah, that's a great question, Eric. I think there's kind of an established norm in the podcasting kind of community and industry, which is where people, particularly from a listenership perspective, discover podcasts by following existing podcasts or at a podcast level. But what's happened over the years is that the sheer extent and volume of episodes has grown so greatly. There's a huge amount, and people are still finding podcasts by searching for the podcast. But, any given podcast now might have a massive kind of myriad of different guests, topics, and everything else discussed. And so I think people are missing out on really great episodes because they're just following existing subscriptions, or now and then something their friend might send them. The challenge, though, historically, really, this has been that there's been no real way to understand at an episode level kind of what's being discussed, talked about what you might find interesting as a listener. So actually it's a really difficult problem to solve. But thankfully that's one that we're kind of delving into actually as a company, which is great. I think Luke and I were talking about an analogy recently actually on this topic really in terms of like searching within an episode. Kind of imagine going back kind of 10 years or 20 years and the only way to search the internet was by the meta title and meta description of web pages. Search would be rubbish. And so that's kind of what we're left with today, kind of 20 years after that analogy in podcasts. And so we're trying to change that by looking deep into the episode, into the transcript, and really understanding kind of what is being talked about. And so therefore helping people, well, one of the problems we can solve is to help people to find better episodes to listen to that suit them.
Yeah, I think sort of given the history of sort of where podcasts came from, sort of this sort of very open sort of audio blog type thing. There wasn't a ton of them. There weren't necessarily really long form interviews or really varied topics. Historically, it was like, hey, you like just like a blog. Hey, I like this person. I listen to the blog. I like the podcast. I'll listen to the podcast. But as sort of podcasts have evolved, become more commercial, become more mainstream, there's way more of them. It's like, I might not want to listen to or even see every interview from one of my favorite podcasters, because only maybe 5% of the guests I care about. And then there's probably tons of other podcasts out there that occasionally have really interesting guests that are right up my alley, but I don't particularly, need to be aware of everything else. So I think sort of that is really something which I think is probably going to change in the future, but I guess we'll see.
Yeah, like so much in what you guys shared. I know from my own experience, the way I tend to find podcasts has been I will listen to a podcast, and if they have a guest who has a podcast and I, for whatever reason, on that episode kind of clicked, I'll go check out their podcast. But like the looking for things, or if I see a blog post or a LinkedIn post or see something out there and I'm like, okay, that could be interesting, or I know who that person is. Yeah. But it's just almost impossible to find. So I love what you guys are doing. Like, there are topics I would love to go deep on. I just don't know where to look, or I don't know how to find those episodes, but I'm sure they're out there.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where I think that's where by looking at the transcripts and starting to apply some sort of more modern search techniques like semantic search, kind of getting an understanding of what's going on, we found that it's really, you can sort of do a search saying, hey, how do I use marketing for my bootstrap business where I don't have a budget and, I don't want to spend money, like a really sort of a very broad kind of meaning. And then we can start find interesting conversations that sort of covered that meaning. And then also looking at other things like audio quality and, how long does the host speak? How long does the guest speak? All there's so many levels that you can look at. And if you bring that all together, you can really have really like next level discoverability, which I think would be really amazing. And for me, it's like I want to open some days I open up my podcast player and there's some great stuff to listen to, and other days maybe not, or other days it might be I've only got 15 minutes and I want something that's like a quick hit. I want to be like inspired, let's say. Like I want to open up my podcast player and I want to say, hey, I've got 15 minutes feeling like I want to be inspired to, put in some extra hours. What can I listen to, right? Like, give me an episode. Or maybe it's like, hey, I've got 3 hours. The podcast player kind of knows what I listen to, the guests that I like. I'm looking to go really deep on this topic. But I'm also looking to learn from somebody that maybe I haven't listened to that much. Like, give me an episode, right? And maybe it pops up something where it's like, really interesting. So I think that's another thing which I find interesting. It's like you're not always in the same headspace. You're not always looking to listen to the same stuff. So why is it always just this feed of like, here's what you've listened to in the past, here's what you like.
All right, folks, a quick breather here. In my time building my business, I've come to a profound realization. Certain tools can be a game changer. That's why I'm excited to talk about Lead Feeder. It's a tool that helps you cut through the data and turn those website visitors into solid leads. Lead Feeder shows you which companies are checking out your site, tracking their behavior, and integrates all this with your CRM. Result? Your secret weapon for targeted lead engagement and making it easier for your team to convert website traffic into sales. Head to leadfeeder.com for a free demo and get a free extended premium trial when you let the rep know that you found about Lead Feeder through the It's Marketing's Fault podcast. All right, back to the show. Yeah, breaking it out of that typical feed is the trick. And I was curious because podcasts started out as audio, it's been primarily audio. We've seen this surge in video podcasting, but everybody who does a video podcast still creates an audio podcast that they, goes to, the various, Apple and Spotify and, Google and all those good places. Do you think because it was an audio file and that was the medium, do you think that was the challenge of making things easier to find? And now that the technology is changing, you think that was the limiting factor?
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the past, 100%, because, only in the last couple of years has it become affordable to transcribe at scale in a way that isn't like pretty bad, and then also like analyze that. And so, in the past, it was just, hey, here's an MP3. Like, go back to 2012, here's an MP3 with an hour and a half of a conversation. It's like, it was very unaffordable, very, like, just basically impossible to do anything with that at any sort of scale. And it was unaffordable to pay someone to transcribe that. Like, so like the Googles of the world, I'm sure they probably thought about it. Like, we've got an army of people transcribing these things. But it's just, it was just unaffordable. And I think that's really changed recently.
Yeah, I've got an extra point to make there. I think kind of 10 years ago or longer when podcasts first started, I would imagine that it was purely for kind of entertainment purposes would be the reason you pick up your podcast and you have a listen. Whereas these days, I know that a lot of people, including myself, kind of turn to podcasts because, for example, an author that they follow has released a new book, and actually instead of reading the book, maybe they want to listen to that author on a podcast to get the inside scoop. Or maybe they've just started a new job. This was me a few years ago in kind of finance industry in the fintech, and just wanted to get really under the surface of kind of what the hell they're even doing. And so like my listen habits have changed beyond just entertainment through to actually education. And I guess like Luke said earlier, like the length of the podcast I listen to would actually differ as such as well. So I think, yeah, the nature in the marketing mix of podcasts and the reason people listen is changing as well.
And then,
oh, go ahead.
Sorry, good. Final point on that is sort of, I also think the thing that's a little bit different is because podcasts historically were sort of this black box MP3, the conversations, the content, the style, much more conversational, less structured, less intentionally structured, less focused on keywords and all that type of stuff, which has made the medium wonderful, right? It's made it so it's natural. When you read blog posts now, there's so many blog posts that are just like SEO optimized. It's like, you know what? Like, I feel like I read something, but I don't know what I actually just read. But because of that, it's a lot harder to make sense of, you know, what's the meaningful content in this podcast, right? And so I think that's where sort of the evolution of machine learning and LLMs and vector databases and all this nerdy tech stuff. As a marketing podcast, I don't want to get too nerdy, but I think that's really also helped to kind of making sense of unstructured data, making sense of conversations, making sense of emotions, those types of things. There's things that are now very possible to do in a meaningful way, whereas 10, 15 years ago, it was really just much harder to do that type of stuff.
Yeah, just the technological advances in the learning models, in the search capabilities. I mean, that has truly changed the game. And like you say, too, transcription, good transcription, like, you know, the cost has come so far down. Like, I remember trying to get some automated transcription a few years ago, and it was like, wow, it's okay, but like the only reason I had it was like for SEO. That was it. It was like it was just not really readable. But now it does so much better, and it grabs the actual words within the context, and it spells them correctly, and it actually handles things like different accents and different, you know, just a variety of different things. Like it is completely changed the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what prompted you guys to say, hey, we want to create PodEngine? What was that? What was the truth behind that?
So it's actually, it was an accident. Like all great things in life, it was an accident. So Joe and I have known each other for a long time. We met when I was doing a poker business way back in the day, and met through an online forum. This was before Reddit, and we just kept in touch over the years. But we never had a chance to work with each other for a while. And last summer, we both had an opportunity, some time, and we thought, you know what would be really cool? It'd be really cool if whenever I want to learn something, the learning would be delivered to me in my own format. So if I wanted to learn about, you know, how to do audio transcriptions, right? It's like, or I wanted to learn about, you know, how to make a podcast. It's like, well, I am the type of learner who likes concrete stuff, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so we started building that using sort of AI and things like that. And what we realized is AI is really, really good at distilling the general consensus. It's not very good at having opinions. It's not very good at being interesting or having interesting opinions. And as both being sort of avid podcast listeners, we thought, you know what? There's some really amazing podcasts that have some really, really amazing insights in. What if we start transcribing those podcasts and injecting them into this sort of like learning, training platform? We got pretty mixed / bad feedback on the actual training stuff. We got some great feedback on the podcast stuff. And so basically, November last year, we decided, you know what, this training stuff's not really going anywhere, but we're getting some really good feedback on this podcast stuff. And it turns out we did the math, and we're like, we could transcribe a lot of podcasts and analyze them without spending, millions of dollars. And so we decided, you know what, let's transcribe all these podcasts, let's put them into a database, let's start using some machine learning and AI, and let's see what kind of value we can get out of it. And now, to all the listeners out there, technology in search of a problem is not a good idea. So don't do what I'm saying. But so we ended up we did have some good feedback, and we sort of built the technology out. And then along the way, we found, some interesting use cases, and we continue to find lots more.
Technology in search of a problem. Yep, I get that. I love it. So who is PodEngine for? Like, is it for just just listeners who want to know? Is it B2B? Is it who's it for?
Yeah, so I'll start that off, and Joe, you can hop in. And so we talked a lot about sort of the B2C listener experience type of stuff, and that's where, sort of long-term, big picture, I would love to solve that, or I would love for somebody else to use PodEngine to solve it. But the reality is that's, as someone who's historically been a bootstrap founder, it's just a little bit too big and daunting for us to tackle right now. So we are offering a super generous free tier. People can search the website. We're having free recommendations, and we're going to continue to put the transcripts up and really try to make it so the podcast community will be able to leverage that. And hopefully through the API and things, people can start putting some of this stuff into the listener experience. But the primary focus in terms of who it's for from a business perspective is we have 3 B2B use cases that we're found some good success with. So, Joe, you want to talk about this?
You were doing a great job. You continue to.
No, go for it, Joe. I insist.
I guess to kind of up level a bit, going all the way from the current free tier and kind of the rationale behind that through to our main focus right now. At the moment, for listeners and anyone visiting the site, you can do a bunch of things, and they're all about kind of search and discovery. But that's not our kind of core customer focus. So, if you want to come to the site, you can search by keyword, by question, like Luke mentioned. And soon you'll be able to search within an episode, you'll be able to chat with an episode. So if someone's listened to this and they think, oh, Joe mentioned something about, X, Y, Z, you can ask without knowing the actual keywords, and they'll return the actual kind of snippet for the conversation. So that sort of stuff for the listener experience is coming soon, or not just listeners, for anyone. And then kind of going through to the other end of the spectrum, we're kind of entering the kind of business podcasting kind of space. And that's a whole new world to us. And I'll be honest, we're kind of still learning a lot. Like Luke mentioned, we started this in November last year, and it's been a real crash course. But right now, what that means is our focus is with podcast guest booking agencies, and we're helping them to kind of streamline their processes. And because we have the full transcript, we have all this AI and machine learning in our systems, we can really help them to uncover the most relevant podcasts to place their guests on. And then soon we'll be helping them to craft the most relevant outreach by taking things from within the transcript themselves, apply that to what their client knows about or their areas of expertise, and then really kind of helping them to outreach at scale, but also with a personalized touch. So keeping the human in the loop and not just automating. I'm sure you, Eric, get a lot of kind of spam requests from people looking to be a guest on the pod. And then from then on, I suppose we've really kind of realized there's a big bunch of problems that exist in the kind of business of podcasting area for podcasters themselves. So that's kind of finding guests, being a guest on other podcasts, researching guests, finding advertisers and sponsors for their pod, being able to kind of market their pod with like a chat-like interface and embedding that on the website. There's a whole bunch of things which kind of aren't being solved or well served today that we're kind of exploring. But,
so right now, today, our users are people who want alerts. When is my brand being mentioned? When am I being mentioned? When is my competitors being mentioned? So we have a number of paid users for that. We also have some free tier for some basic alerts. And like Joe alluded to, we have an invite only for actual podcasters and some sort of the universe of agencies that exist in the podcast world. So guest booking agencies, sponsors, because like Joe said, if you're a really big podcast, these things are easier because you can have a staff but this sort of the smaller middle tier of podcasts, these problems are really, really hard. And we're helping our customers solve those.
And I think that's huge just from a labor perspective. Communication, what can be automated, streamlined. Obviously, you're making it sound conversational, but at the same time, like there's just a lot of emails that go back and forth. Like there's just a lot of process. There's a lot of invites sent out, right? Between agencies, between shows. And so being able to get a handle on that is huge. All right, folks, a quick breather here. In my time building my business, I've come to a profound realization. Certain tools can be a game changer. That's why I'm excited to talk about Lead Feeder. It's a tool that helps you cut through the data and turn those website visitors into solid leads. Lead Feeder shows you which companies are checking out your site, tracking their behavior, and integrates all this with your CRM. Result? Your secret weapon for targeted lead engagement and making it easier for your team to convert website traffic into sales. Head to leadfeeder.com for a free demo and get a free extended premium trial when you let the rep know that you found about Lead Feeder through the It's Marketing's Fault podcast. All right, back to the show.
Yeah, and I think, and sort of opening the kimono a little bit, this is the first podcast I've ever been on. And so this is an interesting exercise because one of the things we're thinking about, right, is sort of as an individual, how do I find interesting podcasts to go on? As a podcaster, how do you find interesting guests? But then once you're about, before you go on, it's really good to do a little bit of research, right? And so, I went and I listened to a couple of your previous episodes. I read through a couple of transcripts. But what we're working on is sort of to automate that, right? It would be really amazing if I could have got, and you actually said something that was amazing to prepare, but, hey, here's Eric's podcast in the past. This is what they've talked about. This is what they have. Find white space, find interesting things. And then the flip side for the host is, now for me, it wouldn't be great because I've only ever been on 0 podcasts, one at the end of this one. But it would have been really, imagine if I've been on 10, 20 podcasts and, wouldn't it be amazing to know, hey, here's the things that I typically talk about and here's the things that I haven't spoken about. So you're not just repeating the same old questions. Hey, Joe, sorry, I could hit the typing.
Sorry.
So you're not just hearing the same old questions. You're actually getting to interesting content and not repeating the same thing. Because this is another thing I get frustrated with is I have someone I like, they're doing the circuit, they release a book or whatever, and they go on a bunch of podcasts and they just say the same thing over and over again. And I'm sure obviously that's just part of it being commercialized and things like that. But as a host, if the host was able to be better prepared and to find those interesting white spaces and things, I think it would lead to much better outcomes for everybody.
Yeah, and what you were talking about there is really can save a ton of time because as a host, as I prepare for guests, I do research on the guests, I do research on their company, I try to look at their posts. Like if I've heard of bigger podcasts. It all depends on how many people you have on your staff, but even then, you're still limited in terms of the research you can do. If you're able to go out and say, okay, here, exactly like you talked about, here are things they've talked about, here's something they mentioned once, or, hey, I'm thinking about asking them about this thing. They've never discussed this on any podcast they've been on. Ooh, yes, we want to latch onto that. Like that's huge for a host. That shrinks the prep time down tremendously. The flip side, and this is something that when I talk with people about and I write about is, as a guest, how do you prepare? Because every host is different. You're walking in. It's like a cold call almost for you guys, right? You walk in, you're like, I have no idea what to expect. I sort of do. Some hosts, they do a great job of prepping. Others, like you're walking in and you have no clue. And so how, as a guest, can you take control over your half of the conversation so that you're not surprised?
Yeah, exactly. And then the nice thing is, right, and then by taking out a lot of the grunt work, the time you are spending preparing is actually focused on the things that are important, right? So it's like once you have all that information, then you can really start to think about, okay, what are the opportunities? What are we going to talk about? What are we going to talk about? You're not just going through the motions and just doing essentially research or paying an admin or paying someone on your team to do the research. You can be much, much more focused. And so, yeah, super excited about that.
So let me just follow up one more on the agency perspective, because I can see that idea being very helpful for an agency, because then it's not sort of mass, for lack of a better term, mass email. You can really find the best opportunities for your guests. What kind of, as you've talked with people, I'm assuming they sound I'm assuming they're pretty receptive to that. What have you heard that they're looking for?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So on the agency side, it's been, and that was where we sort of stumbled into that as well. I've always known that podcasts need guests, but I never realized there was entire industries built around it. And so we have 5 sort of beta customers who are currently working very closely with us, and the plan is in the next few weeks to release that sort of more publicly available. And the things that they've really wanted was more automation, less manual stuff. So they are doing a lot of the things we're talking about, but they're doing it manually. So it's like they find, they have their client or their guest, or as an individual, like I might have I know who I am. I find the podcast that I think would be good to target, and then actually go and just listen to, the not very good agencies, they just spam, and those aren't the ones that really are target demographic. But the good ones, they listen to 5, 6, 7 episodes. Maybe they transcribe them. Maybe they, do a bunch of other analysis, and that might take 1 or 2 hours per podcast. They craft a message, and so it's just a ton of work. And so what they really want is they want sort of all of that to be significantly streamlined, so then they can focus way more on the actual process of sort of getting the person on the podcast. The other part as well, what we ran into is a lot of the agencies, they sort of, it's actually really interesting. There's 2 types of podcast guest booking agencies in the world, in my opinion. There's the ones who draw a line on, we get you on the podcast, and then everything else is on you. And then there's the ones who are, we're going to get you on the podcast, and we're going to actually try to make you successful. And so the ones who try to get folks on the podcast and make them successful, everything we were just talking about with guest booking, with guest research and host research, they're doing a lot of that stuff manually. It sometimes falls to the wayside because there's just so much going on. And it's like, if they could really help their guests go on the podcast and nail it, that would be a huge value add. And so that's the type of stuff they're also looking for.
Yeah, just one thing to add to that, I guess, we're kind of AI first in many respects, but it's not AI for AI's sake. And so we're freeing up agencies really to spend more time doing things that actually do add value or grow their business. So if they can get more done with less time, then they can use existing spare capacity to either diversify the products that they sell. So instead of just doing the booking, maybe they can do the content repurposing as well and make more money that way. Or they can actually open up the top of the funnel and service more guests with the same amount of resource. And so try to be clever about where we're kind of embedding AI and making sure that we're not doing it just for the sake of it, but because there's actually a real problem looking to be solved.
And that's a really good point. And that's something, just as everybody hears about AI, and you have, people who say it'll solve every problem, and then you have people who are, say the sky is falling and it's the great evil, but really it's a great tool. It's a great assistant to come alongside as you do that work. And I can totally see, as agencies prepare their clients for episodes, being able to generate very quickly and easily, here is your, almost like a press packet for preparation, and just sending that off and emailing it and saying, hey, here's what to consider, here are the highlights. And whereas, like you say, that's hours if you can get to it. And, I got you on this podcast, but we've never had anybody on that podcast before. So now it's just start from scratch. And that's a ton of legwork. Like you say, that's being able to free that up so that people can do people jobs, having conversations, expanding. I mean, that to me sounds like a huge win.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing that with the AI, sort of the conversation about AI that I come back to. So obviously, in the future, we don't know where it will end up, but certainly where we are today, it reminds me of when all the chess computers came out and everyone was like, okay, no one's going to play chess anymore. Well, what actually happened was human with computer just became so much better than the human by itself, and also better than the computer by itself. And it was that partnership, because it was allowed the human to sort of work with the computer and try different things, and that combination made things much better. And I think at least the current state today of where we are is the same thing, where these are still tools. And I think if you just expect that they're going to be able to automate everything and you're just not going to have to do anything, I think we are a number of years, maybe decades away from that. And so today, it's like, if you are working with the tools, you're going to be so much better at what you're doing. And like you said, Eric, focus on the human stuff, right? Like the nuance and the emotion and really like thinking about things and the strategy, right? Like the big picture stuff. That's where I think that, we're just much better at that stuff. But yeah, the listening to the transcript, what did they talk about, right? It's like, we don't need to be doing that anymore. Just like we don't need to be multiplying big numbers together or, averaging stuff in a spreadsheet, right? It's all been automated for us. So I feel like, at least for the foreseeable future, that's kind of the world we live in.
So Joe, let me ask you this. How do you respond when people say Google works well enough for me? Like, I know like some of your key customers, they're like, yeah, Google doesn't do anything, like it doesn't help me at all. But I think there has to be this mindset of I don't know that I need as much as you're providing, like I can do enough with Google. How do you respond to those people?
So it's a really good point. I mean, Google exists to be a generalist search engine. It doesn't exist to solve specific problems for specific cohorts of people and sub-cohorts of people and so on and so forth. So yes, you can find podcasts on Google just like you can find any other product, any other service, anything on Google. If you're looking to find a podcast specifically to guest on or to advertise on or something like this, which fits in your workflow, and your workflow might include different tools. You might want to import and export into those tools. You might want to export a list of podcasts and all the rest of it, look into the transcripts. Google doesn't offer any of that. And so we're building a specific suite of tools and features and products to satisfy a very specific set of problems. And I think if we were looking to build a generic search engine for podcasts, of course, we're never going to beat Google. But that's not what we're aiming to do, at least not right now.
And it's the same as Apple have added transcripts, right, as well. And I think the answer there is the same, where it's sort of the big tech companies, like making $100 million is not even worth their time. They only do things now if they can make $1 billion+ doing it, right? And so it's just, so they're much broader. They're solving a wider problem for more people. And that's the beauty of startups and the ecosystem, right? Is it allows for space for companies like two just like random dudes to decide to do something and actually have some success. And so, yeah, by being focused more on power users, the people who really, really need all these other features, that's how we feel like we can build a better product. But for 95% of use cases, you are correct. Like Apple or Google probably solve those use cases pretty well.
And I like how you describe that. It's very specific use cases for a narrow group of people, but that's how, I mean, the best products do that, right? You're solving for that. Let me ask about the advertisers, because you had mentioned that earlier. What if I'm an advertiser? Because advertisers, like, you can pick your metric, whether it's like they're looking at downloads or they're trying to get how many people actually click through the link to go forward, a variety of different things of what they're doing. How does this help the advertisers? Is this where you can go to an agency who is trying to get advertisers connected to shows? Is this an opportunity for businesses who's like, hey, I want to sponsor podcasts, but I don't know where to go? How does that work? Or how do you foresee that working?
Yeah, so on the ad stuff, it's still pretty early and sort of more of a vision, and sort of the way we've thought about advertising in podcasts. You've got sort of your ads, right, which are just like injected, and then you have your sponsorship opportunities, right? The host reads something. We really feel strongly that the sponsorship is probably where we're going to start, because that is an area where, there's just a certain threshold that you have to meet for it to even make sense. So because there's a lot of back and forth, the host has to read, there's all of this stuff that goes on. And so if you're a smaller podcast, or you are a smaller company, maybe a local company, maybe you don't have a huge budget, like you probably don't have the budget to go and spend the types of money you need to get 6 months or 12 months of a sponsored thing, or just the time that it takes to do the outreach. And so for me, I think it would be amazing if it was as easy to sponsor a podcast as it was to pay for a Google keyword, like a Google AdWord, right? Like that would be amazing. So it's like me as a small business, I could go and I could identify some podcasts and relatively straightforward, I could sponsor them. Maybe $500 or $1,000 or $1,500 or whatever, sort of the types of numbers that just don't make sense to do a full contract and 6 month thing. And so that area we think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity. Just like guest booking, it's like that medium tier, that small tier. What would you say about that, Joe?
Yeah, I completely agree. I guess the one way of looking at it for kind of marketers that have been doing this for a while is that, a decade or two ago, you'd have a direct relationship to buy banner space on a website. There'd be a lot of back and forth, contracts signed, you do the designs together. It would take ages. And therefore, you have to deal with large publishers to make it worth anyone's time. I guess it's a similar position now, like Luke alluded to really, in that there's a huge long tail of podcasters. Podcasters podcast for various number of reasons, but a lot of them want to make money out of it. But because they're part of the long tail where they don't have enough kind of listenership, really, for most companies to take them seriously and sponsor them, they're kind of left out of the ability to make money. In many cases, not all, of course. If we can build at some point, and this isn't on the immediate roadmap, but it'd be interesting if we did, like the AdSense, for podcasts, and kind of enable podcasters to make money more easily, enable advertisers and businesses and brands to actually sponsor most relevant podcasts. Because, podcasts, as you know, Eric, they're not necessarily not worth sponsoring just because of a small amount of listenership. They might actually have the most relevant audience for your business, but you're probably just kind of missing out on them because, you're not looking at them. Yeah.
And I think I love that you brought up like that long tail illustration, because I think I think really you guys can tap into that, because, I think of, for everybody listening, if you haven't read Chris Anderson's book, The Long Tail, please go just after you listen to this episode, just go buy it and read it or listen to it. Like it's phenomenal and it's held up. And anyway, that's a side note. Just go do it. The amount of information out there is overwhelming. And like you say, there are podcasts that with high quality, excellent conversations, great content, but they may not get huge downloads. Nobody may know about them, but when suddenly if it's possible to find them, like what you guys are creating with PodEngine, then it's like, okay, it's worth me getting in front of their audience. And if you can make that super easy, man, that's like a no-brainer. It's absolutely worth getting in front of a podcast that gets 30 downloads an episode, because guess what? Probably 20 of those people would buy my stuff tomorrow if they just knew about it. Like that is huge in what you can open up there.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah. We also find, the context around listeners is actually really interesting. So some podcasters make a lot of effort to repurpose content. You'll see them publishing it all over social, in a few months' time publishing the same stuff again. And really, 30 listeners on that type of podcast where they're really repurposing effectively. It's very different to a podcast where they're not doing any repurposing, Maybe the latter, or the former, has a large newsletter, and they started the newsletter, they've got 10,000 subscriptions, and they've just started this podcast, 10 episodes, 30 listeners an episode. There's different ways of looking at the sort of listenership than just that metric alone. So I think that's an interesting area for us to explore in the future as well.
That is being able to sort of even bridge the gap or connect some of those dots between listenership, between other audiences that they have, like newsletter. That's a fascinating, because then you can get a really accurate picture of their reach and who they're reaching.
Yeah, who they're reaching and how they're going about it, right? So it's like if you have two podcasts that have a small listenership, they both are covering the same thing. They both seem pretty reasonable, but then you're able to see, well, this one they post clips on YouTube, they do blog outreach, all this other stuff, and the other one doesn't. Then all of a sudden you probably think, well, that first one is more valuable for me to try to sponsor or to try to go on and that type of stuff. And so it's not just about looking at the transcript, not just about looking at the podcast, it's about looking at the universe that surrounds it, right, as well.
So then it really sounds like, as we'll call it, the true age of the transcript, right? Sort of that, almost like that Gutenberg moment with transcripts where like it's suddenly becoming available to the masses. Like that, it's like the transcript really becomes the key to all of this. Am I hearing that correctly?
Yeah, it becomes the center of the universe, and then all the pieces around it, right? That kind of like make it more valuable. And I do like the age of the transcript, Eric. So if no one's ever, I'll do a search on PodEngine to see if someone's ever said that before, and if not, we're going to attribute it to you on the wiki quote.
I love it. But it just as we're talking here, it's like really this. It is like I think back and like you think about the printing press and when like that just changed the whole scope of things. Like the limiting factor on podcasts up to now is you just can't do anything with it. You can't do anything with an MP3, like not at scale. Mm-hmm. And so being able to get good transcripts, like that opens up the world.
Absolutely.
So before we wrap up, I'm going to throw it out to each of you. One takeaway you would like to leave the listeners with. Joe, what's your one takeaway?
Good question. I love this question as a listener. When you're on the spot, it's far harder to answer. I think my takeaway is kind of challenge yourself to be episode first. If you do listen to podcasts, then challenge yourself to be episode first, and have a look at PodEngine and do a search. And if there's something you're interested in, maybe it's kind of how can I drive more leads to my blog using AI, for example. You can ask that specific question in a semantic way, and you'll get relevant discussions about that topic back. So keywords don't necessarily have to match, but I found myself doing this, finding new episodes based on specific topics and areas. And now I've got 3 times as many subscriptions to far more podcasts. And so my kind of perspective on the podcasting world has definitely grown. So I think, challenge yourself to broaden your horizons on the podcast subscriptions that you already have is my takeaway.
All right, Luke, your takeaway.
Okay, my takeaway for the listener, I'm going to go with something that's not even related to podcasts, but just sort of a high-level takeaway, which is because as I mentioned earlier in the episode, technology searching for a problem. One of the things that, I've been doing this for a long time, and I always seem to somehow forget and rediscover, it's be problem first. Like when you're thinking about what to work on, what to do, what to market, what to sell, like come at it from what's the problem that we're solving? What are we actually trying to help people with, rather than what's the cool shiny thing or what's the cool technology. And so time and time again, I find that I kind of get too into the weeds, and then if I take a step back and really think about, okay, what are we actually solving? What's the problem we're doing? Let's be problem first. It just, everything falls into place. And so I think that's super important.
I like both of those. Problem first, and then from the podcast perspective, think of it in terms of the individual episode specific, and as PodEngine starts rolling out, I mean, it's fascinating as you look at the landscape of technology, where for a long time it was all search engine driven, and then you started seeing searches through YouTube, and now through TikTok, and now through like you're seeing this progression of, instead of just going to Google or Yahoo or Bing or wherever it has been, like it's going much more platform focused or medium focused. And so this opportunity with what you guys are creating, man, suddenly it opens up a world that is not visible today in terms of the content. So for everybody listening, I can't encourage you enough to check this out. So if people want to know more about PodEngine, about each of you, where would you like them to go?
The best place to go, you can visit the website, which is podengine.ai, or you can, look Luke or myself up on LinkedIn or Twitter. My handle is Joe Tannorella. I guess that'll be in the show notes because it's a difficult one to spell.
Yeah, and you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm not a big social guy. I let Joe do all the socials, but definitely follow Joe on Twitter. And then check the website out. And we're just 2 folks. We're really, really passionate about this, and so any feedback, anything, you can just shoot us an email, and our emails are readily available on the website.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, yeah, for everybody listening, we're going to drop those in the show notes. Definitely reach out to them. Check out PodEngine. It is absolutely worth it. Joe, Luke, thanks for chatting with me today. This has been a blast. I learned a ton, and I know the audience will as well.
Awesome. And then we can maybe name this episode The Age of the Transcript. So
there you go.
You heard it here first, folks.
Thanks very much, Eric.
Thanks.